Greetings, fellow thinkers and drinkers, and hard rock and heavy metal fans. Conventional wisdom has it that together, Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin, and Black Sabbath founded, inspired, created what went on to be known as hard rock and heavy metal. If we accept the premise, and I thought, just for fun, it might be interesting to go back and to review or to re-examine their respective debuts and to see how far this theory holds true. Now, obviously, these pronouncements were made with the benefit of hindsight. Nobody going back 57, 56 years ago, 55 years ago in the case of Black Sabbath, could have predicted the influence and effect that these works would have. And there's absolutely no way they could have predicted the evolutions in this type of music that would occur and are still occurring to this day. I suppose that's fairly self-explanatory that all these accolades are, as I said, with the benefit of hindsight. Still, how am I going to be judging this? Well, I'll keep it simple. We'll go through the debut releases of all three, and I'll do them in chronological order that they were released. I got to do them in some order. It seems as good as anything. I'll give a brief evaluation of each of them on its own merits, maybe as it was seen at the time, and try and contrast that with how history sees it. I'll be mentioning originality, as I think it's important, and influence. Not only genre influence, but perhaps influence on the individual band's subsequent direction. Now, obviously, perhaps it's not that obvious, and perhaps it's not true in all cases, that a band's debut went on to be as influential as some of these have been, or have not been. Well, anyway, enough of that. First out the gate is Shades of Deep Purple. Now, Deep Purple were, at least on an individual basis, fairly well-known and established musicians. In particular, Ritchie Blackmore, and even more in particular, John Lord. So these were not, guys fresh out of school, anything like that. They'd learned their trade in various outfits and various situations, and were already respected and experienced musicians by the time they came together, which was effectively a management decision, but this is not a biography. Plaguing the first lineup of Deep Purple was just the constant pressure of touring, with the recording of albums as effectively, I think, seen as an excuse for them to go out and tour, giving them something to promote. Now, their first album is... A lot of people have subsequently said it lacks a little bit of direction, and I suppose, yes, there is some truth in that, but given that 50% of it was devoted to cover versions of other people's songs, perhaps not surprising. And yes, the Vanilla Fudge comparisons have and continue to be made. And I suppose, yes, one has to acknowledge that to some degree. However, having said that, there's still an awful lot of creativity on display. And I don't restrict that to the original material. Hey Joe, and to a greater extent, Help, show, a talented and ambitious band putting their own stamp on what are already established songs. Hush is perhaps the more famous case in point. They really do purplerize it, if that be a word, and sounds very different to the original Joe South recording, and to most of the other covers of the songs that I've heard. It really has an aggression and a force to it that perhaps was quite unique at the time. The original material, One More Rainy Day and Love Help Me, are still heavily influenced by the psychedelic 60s, shall we say, for want of a better expression. Not that they're bad songs, but they're not particularly indicative of where hard rock heavy metal was going to develop. You can say the instrumental and the address, and especially Mandrake Root, the other two original compositions, did, with the benefit of hindsight, hint quite strongly, one could say, at what was to come. Now, Deep Purple were always a musician's band. You could argue, even in their pomp, they prioritized musical virtuosity above perhaps songwriting on occasion. But here we have a couple of tracks that, looking back on it, are very much prototype hard rock songs. Where you draw the line between hard rock and heavy metal is entirely up to you, and I'm not going to be prescriptive on that. But certainly, they're the only things on here, maybe you could argue, hush, I don't know, that you could perhaps almost imagine, if not on Deep Purple in rock, that was to come out a couple of years later, but maybe on the slightly more left field, Fireball. Fireball is the title I'm looking for. But again, that is very much with the benefit of hindsight. Apart from that, there's very little on here. This could have gone anywhere. If you were a young band starting in 1968, they're still at school or whatever, and you bought a copy of this, liked it, and let it influence you, there is no guarantee that what you would have picked up on would have been And the Address or Mandrake Root or something like that. You could have picked up on the more psychedelic stuff, the more adventurous stuff, the classical interludes, maybe just picked up on the musicianship. It's jazzy in places. There is just it is a melting pot of influence, and it is by far the most varied in that regard of the three we're going to discuss. It's very difficult to actually say there's a direct path from this. There was another two albums by Mark I, I know, but to what became Purple's seminal record in rock, the one that is their hard rock heavy metal masterpiece. You can trace some elements back to this, but no. I don't think that their debut, was particularly indicative of either where they would go themselves or the trends the genre would follow, or would develop even going forward. As much as I like it, and I do like it, we move on. As was the case with some of the members of Deep Purple, Jimmy Page, when it comes to Led Zeppelin, was already a well-known name. Abundance of session work, and latterly as a member of the Yardbirds, which became the new Yardbirds, out of which Led Zeppelin arose. John Paul Jones was also a named musician, and quite rightly so. Equally in demand in the session world, looking for something different. Plant and Bonham, no less talented, but did not have the name, the reputation. Jimmy Page had a vision, which seemed to be shared by the rest of the band. And as much as he was very much a traditional blues fan, but he wanted to take these things and develop them, enhance them, progress them, shall we say. He said many times in interviews he had this vision of songs with very much light and shade in them, as opposed to just the monotone, the typical song constructions of the 50s and 60s. He was more ambitious than that, and why not? He also decided he wanted to make things a little heavier, although what that term meant at the time is perhaps unclear. Maybe it's not what we would now define as heavier. Maybe he had something else in his mind. For one thing you can say about Led Zeppelin is they did not morph into anything resembling a heavy metal band. But we're here to discuss their debut. Now, 9 tracks on this one, as opposed to 8 tracks on the Deep Purple debut. 4 of which, as in keeping with Deep Purple, are covers. Perhaps the most impressive one of these, at least for my money, is the cover of John Baez's "Babe, I'm Going to Leave You." Or "I'm Gonna Leave You." I like this. This best perhaps encapsulates Page's stated vision of incorporating his songs with lights and shade. The heavy bits, the acoustic bits, but it has drama. It has bombast to it. Certainly very different from the John Baez's original, but it's extremely ear-catching. And again, it's very difficult sitting here now in 2025 to go back to 1969, 1968, 1969, 1970, and to hear these things for the first time, which I think there would have been a very different experience than listening to them, with the benefit, if that's the word, of the succeeding, of what we've also been able to listen to from the succeeding 50 years. But this has vision, and it's incredibly well executed. The next cover is "You Shook Me," which is a fairly faithful cover of a Willie Dixon standard. If you're into pure blues, and I'm sure you may like this, I am not, therefore I don't. Yes, it's well played, well executed, but I don't like this type of thing, and it does nothing for me. "Dazed and Confused," one of their seminal legendary songs, although it wasn't theirs, was it? Originally credited to Page alone, subsequent, it took several decades, but the legal disputes forced a co-credit for Jake Holmes. But when you listen to the original, it's a cover, guys. It's just a cover. Again, though, it's a good cover. Yes, they do put their own stamp on it, their own individuality on it, but it is, in essence, a cover. I prefer it to the original, certainly. It's one of those songs I really like listening to on the record. Listening to it live, no. Which moves us on to "I Can't Quit You, Baby," which is another Willie Dixon cover. And again, it's another blues standard, and again, I have to say it's well executed, but I can do without it. I really can. I listen to it just for the purpose of this, the exercise of making this video. I hope I'll never have to listen to it again. It's dull, it's repetitive, as is much of the blues, but again, there you have it. This is where they were coming from. And yes, this was their debut, as it was with Deep Purple. They just started as the first step on a journey. But no, I don't know really how much hard rock, certainly very little heavy metal, developed from this. But getting slightly ahead of myself, because there were 5 original tracks on this album. "Good Times, Bad Times" is a fairly basic rock song. But the genre, over the next 50 years, would be full of fairly basic rock songs. And this is a pretty good example of how to write a good, fairly basic rock song. "Your Time Is Gonna Come" is quite interesting. At least I think it is. In some ways, to me, it straddles the transition between the blues, traditional blue-based nature of the covers, effectively, and with hints, and also brings in elements of more, say, traditional rock constructions and rock attributes. I like it. It's not wildly experimental. This is not progressive rock by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's a nice, combining of them both. And ultimately, is it any good as a song? Yes, I think it is. Now, "Communication Breakdown" has to be prototype thrash or metal, at least. Fast, the repetitive riff, catchy chorus, short and to the point. As a basic description, if you're trying to explain to the police which particular hard rock or heavy metal track over the last 50 years committed the offence, and you gave that as a description, they would not be grateful. Probably get done for wasting police time. But it is a classic, and again, you can't deny the influence that had on the genre. Which leaves us with how many more times. Which I tend to have similar feelings about as your time is going to come. There is that sort of traditional element to it, but they are finding their own feet, their own voice. And again, it's another good song, which is fundamentally, I guess, the most important thing. Now, this is a much more focused and cohesive effort than the Deep Purple debut, and probably stands as an album because of that. It's probably, I think, more successful. It's certainly by far the better regarded of the two. By some considerable amount, sold more copies than the Deep Purple debut, and certainly gets more press, and generally is more talked about than the Deep Purple debut. But there's a lot of it I don't like. I really don't. Again, I'm glad they did slowly move away from this pure reliance on the blues. Once they got past, well, it would crop up occasionally, wouldn't it, on Presence, and even in Through the Outdoor, to a greater or lesser extent. But they started to explore new territory and find their own voice. This is probably more influential in terms of the genre, and that's probably as much down to stuff like Good Times, Bad Times, Communication Breakdown. Although the epic scale, if you like, even on the studio version of things like Dazed and Confused, yes, would be repeated by bands going forward. Perhaps not always that successfully. But fundamentally, Zeppelin, and on this record, and that's what we're talking about, there's just too much variety on this. And in terms of what we're looking at, was this an obvious precursor of what was to come? I don't think you can say it is. It's possibly, you could argue, it is more indicative of what was to come than we found on the Deep Purple record. But not significantly different. Again, this could have gone either way, which we know they did. A couple of albums later, they produced Led Zeppelin 3, which was a bit of seen as a left field effort back in the day. But no, if you were that young band in 1969 on this occasion, and you'd bought this looking for inspiration, there's no guarantee that anything even resembling heavy metal or the heavier end of hard rock would be the result. There's, again, too many influences on this, you can't really say. Which leaves us with Black Sabbath, the last to be released Friday, February the 13th, 1970. At the time, Black Sabbath were the least known band, and the individual members were the least known. It had a huge local following. Well, I think perhaps in many places in the UK they'd been over to mainland Europe. But they had not reached anything, and nobody released anything, I should say, and nobody had the industry reputation that did John Lord, Ritchie Blackmore, John Paul Jones, Jimmy Page, etc. And perhaps because of that, they felt, I don't know, they had less pressure on them. They could just, produce whatever turned them on, as it were, and effectively what they did. It's another one of, another thing all these three albums have in common is they were recorded very quickly, which explains a lot of the covers. Certainly, perhaps on the first two, less so on this, but there are a couple. But especially, I think, in the case of Black Sabbath, they just went into the studio and recorded what they were playing live at the time. Perhaps for that reason, it does sound the most organic of the three. And it's certainly the most original of the three. I don't think well, I'm sure somebody will try and argue that point, but putting it on. This is as bluesy as Sabbath ever got, and they kicked that into touch after this record, and there's not that much on it, thankfully. There is very little, if anything, you could point to and say this is 60s or psychedelic 60s. Nothing like that. No keyboards, nothing. And there's only 2 covers on this album. First one, Evil Woman, which was only on the European version of the album. It was a cover by a band, Crow. Not the greatest song ever, and it was released as a single. They've given it their own, Sabbath spin to it. It's not a bad song, and it was released as a single, and you can perhaps understand why. So, there's certainly nothing else on the album that was obvious single material. Not back in 1970, I don't think. If you were in America, at least, you didn't get this. You got an original composition, Wicked World, which is a far superior song. And this is more in keeping with the rest of the tone of the album. The other cover was by Ainsley Dunbar's band, whose name has escaped him, but never mind, called Warning. It clocks in about 10 minutes. And you really do feel it, some of it on the studio recording is filling up space. And it's on the instrumental passage of this, where the band's, the lingering or the dying embers of blues influences are slowly going out. Possibly you could argue this would not have been totally out of place on the Led Zeppelin debut, but it's utterly inconceivable on the Deep Purple debut. To make it clear, Led Zeppelin were very blues American influence and sounding band. Deep Purple were not. They were a European classically influenced band with a bit of rock and roll. Yes, they liked the blues, but it was not their dominant influence. And I shouldn't need to say this, but you listen to all of these 3 albums, and they're completely different. Although they are, as we said in the beginning, seen to have been, the albums that started a genre. But it's the original material on the Black Sabbath debut that really makes a difference. Black Sabbath, The Wizard, Behind the Wall of Sleep, NIB, and Sleeping Village. Nothing like that to be found, I don't think, anywhere, but most certainly not on the Deep Purple or the Led Zeppelin debuts. And this is very much, I have to say, what went on to be heavy metal. Although in saying that, I'm trying not to do Black Sabbath a disservice. I mentioned when I discussed the other 2 that the virtuosity of the players, the ambition, the various influences, how they like to combine things in creating their own voice. It's no less true of Black Sabbath. But what happened was there's an aspect of Black Sabbath music that it was fundamentally riff-based. Whereas, they didn't have John Lord, for example, or even John Paul Jones in Led Zeppelin. But having said that, both Blackmore and Page were quite capable of composing chordal-based arrangements and songs. Now, this is riff-based, very much riff-based, and that is what the heavy metal genre took out of it. What it didn't generally take out of it is the wonderfully jazz-infused rhythm section of Bill Ward and Geezer Butler. And the other thing the heavy metal genre didn't take out of this was swing. Now, all these bands, to some extent, have swung, but nobody really quite swings like Bill Ward and Geezer Butler on some of these songs, and many of their albums going forward. One aspect of, when I say Black Sabbath are hugely influential, and quite rightly they are, but that is one aspect that very few, if any, subsequent bands picked up on. And I tend to think that in some ways Sabbath get a bit of a bum rap on that their ability to compose, complex, multi-tempoed, pieces. Some of their songs, there's 3 or 4 great songs in one. And it's not just about heavy riffing. But their riffs are just so dominant, I suppose. It's on the face of it, especially when they started to down tune. But anyway, that was all in the future. But I mean, certainly this has to be the closest to what the next 50 years of development in these genres would produce. I don't think there's any real debate about that. Some will argue that the Led Zeppelin album is the best one, and they're free to do that. I don't think it is. I think the Black Sabbath album is easily the best one, because there's nothing on it I don't like. They were for a long time, however, not always seen as being in the same virtuoso class or musicianship class as Purple and Zeppelin, which I think is unfair. It's also true to say, though, that especially when Ian Gillan joined Deep Purple and Robert Plant were by many orders of magnitude superior singers to Ozzy Osbourne. Somehow made his voice suit the music, or perhaps they made the music suit his voice, and it worked in context, but I don't think there's any argument that the other two were superior singers. And that was it, really, wasn't it? I mean, when we look what heavy metal became, you could argue communication breakdown, but that was 2.5 minutes on an album. It was indicative of what was to come, and a lot of people did, as I said at the time, did replicate that approach. But I think when you're looking at heavy metal in particular, there's absolutely no doubt that Sabbath were the ones that influenced it. And I don't really think, in descending order, I think the Zeppelin had some influence, and the Deep Purple album less. Zeppelin would, and I think it's going to be something like the riff to Whole Lot of Love that people always hold up and say, well, or it's going to be the utter heaviness of Deep Purple in rock, or in a couple of albums' time, the riff to Smoke on the Water, because there is no more stereotypical, shall we say, heavy metal song, unfortunately, than Smoke on the Water. It really became a blueprint for what was to follow. But they were just, I would say isolated examples, but they were not totally indicative of what those bands were about. It was Sabbath that relied on the riff. Complex arrangements, time changes, wonderful understanding of musical dynamic, being able to paint and subtle lines and with a thicker brush, however you want to put it. But it was those primitive, or perhaps those most instantly apparent aspects of Black Sabbath music that I think ultimately went on to, I suppose, define heavy metal, and perhaps in many ways to limit it. Not too many bands, and I'm sure somebody will say, but what about, and yes, I'm sure you're right. But we're talking about the genre as a whole. I think there wasn't too many of the bands that picked up on what's on the subtleties and the innate variety of what Sabbath were doing. They were captivated by the riff. All right, I just thought I'd mention that. So please feel free to comment if you agree or you do not agree. And while you're doing it, feel free to share, to subscribe, and to like. And as usual, I thank you for your indulgence. I wish you well, and Maçhonquèrre.